Hello, and welcome to the second video in the series on philosophies in Honkai style. This time I want to cover the storyline in Penacony from 2.0 to 2.2, because the storyline touched on a lot of questions that, first of all, are just very common philosophical questions, a whole topic in philosophy for thousands of years. But also, the storyline this time was very emotional. It drew a lot of people into this reflective kind of phase or emotion or thought process, reflecting on everything that happened in the story. And I think that this review of philosophy throughout 2.2 will hopefully give shape to the kind of thoughts and emotions that are going through people's minds as they're playing through the story. So, further ado, let's get into it. Let's start with talking about what the main conflict is in the story. If you can't tell, we're going to be talking about spoilers through the end of 2.2. So do not continue watching if you haven't already viewed those in their entirety. So to start, Robin and Sunday, walking through the streets of Penacony, are having a discussion about what happiness is. Because both Robin and Sunday have a shared dream. And this dream is to help as many people as possible to flourish, to be happy, right? It's a genuinely good dream. It's one born of love, genuine love for everyone. But the question is, of course, what is a life that flourishes, and how do we attain that? And in this dialogue between Robin and Sunday, we see Sunday's issues that he's thinking about throughout his process. First, he talks about this illusion of self-value in the middle of this screenshot here. People believe they have a predetermined value to fulfill. Gaining value means gaining power, and those deemed worthless are seen as the weak. However, value doesn't come out of thin air, and there's a limit to it. To accumulate value, people have to take from others, so they'll be exploited and oppressed. He continues on elsewhere, saying another name for the future is self-value. Some are born weak and vulnerable. Some find themselves trapped in unfortunate circumstances. Some fall victim to malice and cowardice. When it comes to survival, everyone is equal, and the weak can only watch as their value or future gets constantly diminished by external forces. And he concludes with this thought of that people often forget that when the first bird took flight, the entire world envisioned a future where no more fledglings would ever crash to their death. And he's referencing there, of course, the Charmony birds. I think they're Charmony robins. That in their youth, Sunday and Robin tried to save, but when they let go out of the birdcage, it plummeted to its death because it wasn't strong enough to fly. Sunday's thought process here goes along the thought that if we go back towards this idea of self-value, and then his survival of the fittest idea that he talks about later on this page as well, that's where all the tragedies in the world come from. And they come to Sleep Dream and Penacony to escape from that reality and find solace. He's saying that because, and we can see this in our own lives as well, how we tend to give value to success in our lives, right? Success and prestige and things like that. To give an example, if you're trying to think of, trying to live the most meaningful life you could, and you're thinking about maybe I should go to college. What college? And then you probably try to find out what the best colleges are, right? The most prestigious ones, the ones that would seem the most valuable. But of course, everyone can't go to like MIT, for example, for engineering. There's limited seats. There's a high bar for acceptance. People have to fight over those admissions. And people tend to value these things a lot. They tend to base their own value, their self-value, if you will, on these quantifiers for success, right? And for power. So that's why he's talking about here, you have a predetermined value to fulfill. It's limited, Those who are deemed worthless are seen as weak. You might think about someone who's born in unfortunate circumstances who doesn't have the opportunities someone else does. They would be thought of as weak, thought of as not being able to attain that fullness of life and value that they're looking for. And Sunday sees this as a problem. Right. That's their conclusion. He wants to change that. So the question, of course, is how do we go about changing it? And that's where the conflict comes into. So let's jump into the actual end conflict. Here we have Sunday. Sunday and Robin and National Express, the whole group, have a genuine love for everyone. They want to save everyone, right? That's their commonality. But the problem is that their understanding of this differs. For Sunday, because of self-value and the survival of the fittest, you can't really save everyone in reality. Because everyone is unequal in reality. It's a typo of. It's supposed to be in. Leading to survival of the fittest. His idea of saving everyone can only be done in a dream. Hence, of course, the whole plot line. For Robin National Express, though, they know people want to live in reality, not in a dream. And the freedom to choose our own fate, not forced into an ending, is essential for us to be truly fulfilled because we're free human beings, right? We have free will. Our autonomy is important. Taking that away from us is never a good thing. It doesn't, even if it's good for us in the short term, fundamentally we have to make the choices for ourselves to be truly fulfilled. So the questions that come from this are, what is a fulfilled and meaningful life? Sunday asks this to Robin and the National Express, and they obviously disagree on that. And then how does one attain that life? Later on, we'll go and see what the answers that are presented in the game are to these questions. In the conclusion to this here in the 2.2 storyline. But I want to delve into the questions about the meaning of life in philosophy. So let's delve into this. Let's ask ourselves what this fully means. All the different answers that philosophy has to these questions. And then we'll come back and look at the storyline and see, okay, this is what they're saying philosophically. This is where it matches up. These are the answers that they're giving us. How can we understand that in the lens of philosophy? And perhaps even apply it to our own lives. So let's get into that. When it comes to the meaning of life, there's two kind of ways you can immediately approach it. And that comes off of the question of, is this meaning something real, independent of ourselves, our mind? And the two obvious answers are yes. An objectivist answer, or no. This is either a nihilist or subjectivist answer. I should just have it go out this way so it's easier to read. The objectivist answer says that there's meaning independent of our minds. So, for example, I'll just give the most obvious example of this. So you might have you might have Aquinas drawing from Aristotle and Augustine, and he might say if we have let's say a sunset is meaningful in itself, right? That would be an example of what one says as subjectivist. The general idea is that things that exist, or I guess I would say existence, is meaningful itself. I'll just put that there. That's more clear. Existence is meaningful in itself is probably the idea of this. So a sunset we're not giving the sunset meaning. We're not defining its value or anything like that. When we see a beautiful sunset, we love the beautiful sunset because it's meaningful in itself. Its existence is meaningful. So for the scholastics like Aquinas and then other people, they often talk about the ontological good. Ontological means of being, related to being, right? So the ontological good or value, because meaning of life also often refers to value as well. Meaning or value or ontological goodness, these are all kind of the same idea that we're talking about. So Aquinas and philosophers in that field, many of the Thomists, the medieval authors, virtue ethicists, Catholic philosophers, and then talk about ontological goodness. They're talking about a real objective meaning or value to things. Something independent of just our perception, something real of the thing itself. So this view for Aquinas would be that existence itself is an ontological good, is meaningful. We don't need to have someone perceiving it or thinking about it or valuing it for it to be meaningful. Just the existence itself has value. On the other hand, you might say no. That's not the case. Oh, I should also mention that this is not just Aquinas. It's also there's other theologians, but also there's also secular objectivist views as well. So it's not dependent on religion at all. That's what I'm trying to say. There's plenty of secular, just normal philosophers outside of Aquinas and theologians and the medieval philosophers who believe in objectivism. There's a full paper survey some years ago, and they showed a pretty even divide between objectivists and subjectivist views, between philosophers who were not into religion at all. So this is not just a religious point of view, it's just it's a genuine philosophical view, which happens to also align with religion, but also secular views. So I just don't want people to mischaracterize this as just religion, right? You don't have to be religious to believe in an objective meaning to life. There's naturalist views and there's stuff like that. But I'm not going to go into all the papers. You can look this up. I'll have links below in the for the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on the meaning of life. And in there you can read through that section and see different arguments for objectivist views and see, okay, here are the secular philosophers who are arguing for an objective value to life, and here's why they're arguing for it. And you can see that it's not dependent on religious principles at all, necessarily. And then, of course, there's Aquinas and others who do relate it to religion. So anyway, to here, there's the two splits for the no category would be in the towards the nihilist view, the subjectivist view, and that relates kind of around this question of existential dread. And before I go into that, actually, the question that the subjectivist or nihilist faces when they're looking at the meaning of life and they say there's no objective meaning is, how do we ground meaning without a mind independent source? And what they mean here is one of the objectivist objections to nihilist or subjectivist claims is that meaning seems arbitrary if it's wholly based on yourself. So for example, can you really find meaning in having exactly 1,200 hairs on your head? So there was someone who said, this is very important to me, right? It's very meaningful that I have exactly this number of hairs on my head. Objectivists would say, well, how is that more or less meaningful than someone who values saving lives as a doctor? Obviously, most people are going to say, well, obviously saving lives is more important. But if the only grounding for your meaning is just in yourself, just in your mind, how do you validate that? How do you say, if there's no mind-independent source, then why wouldn't it be just as important for someone to have exactly 1,200 hairs on their head as to someone else saving people's lives as a doctor? And what this leads to is the question of arbitrariness. Is it just arbitrary what we're giving meaning to? Because if it's fully arbitrary and there's no real reason for it, that leads one to maybe think that meaning it just is made up. It's not really valuable. It's not really real. Which leads to something called existential dread. I'm not going to try to give a precise definition because different existentialists are going to give different understandings of this. But in general, you can think of it as kind of dread about what meaning in life is. And it's questions like this which might arouse this kind of existential dread. Questions that make you question what meaning is in a way that makes you fear that there isn't any meaning. So obviously one response to this is simply to say, there is no meaning. And that response would lead to value nihilism, which is the rejection of all value, meaning. Another response would be to say, we ground meaning in our choice of who we are. This would be something like Jean-Paul Sartre, who talks about his main taglines are things like radical freedom, things like exigency is not born of value, value is born of exigency. So Jean-Paul Sartre is one of the existentialists. He argues a lot about this idea that there is no mind-independent meaning to things. That's what this quote kind of refers to. Exigency is not born of value, meaning there's not a value out there that causes us to want to act. Rather, when we value things, that leads us to want to act. And it's our choice of what we value, choice of who we are, our radical freedom to determine what our values are and who we are, that defines who we are and what our meanings are. However, it's possible to go against this, to rebel against this. For example, Albert Camus. He critiques Sartre pretty heavily. Calling his choice or his meaning as a false hope. Camus's thought is ultimately you're not really creating meaning at all. You're just making a false hope for meaning. You're not actually generating value by choosing who you are. You're making yourself feel like you're being valuable, feel like you have some kind of meaning. But in reality, you don't. In reality, you have to face, it's what we call it absurdism. Life is absurd in its lack of meaning. Now, this sounds like value nihilism. However, one of the principles of value nihilism, I don't want to say principles because it doesn't really have principles per se, but one of the conclusions of value nihilism is that if there is no value at all, then if we compare two states, we cannot find a valuable difference between them. So we cannot prefer one state to another. Oops, I meant to go over here. Did not mean to make it go over that far, but whatever. There's no value at all. We compare states. We can't find a valuable difference between them, so we can't prefer one state to the other. Which means that, for example, and this is one of the questions that Albert Camus brings up, the question of suicide, which is, if everything is meaningless, why should I not commit suicide? And this leads into his myth of Sisyphus, which is about his response to this question of suicide in light of absurdism. And his answer is, this is a quote you probably heard before, "You must imagine Sisyphus happy." His dialogue in Myth of Sisyphus is about Sisyphus, who in the Greek mythology is cursed to roll a boulder up a hill and then watch that boulder fly back down the hill. And then he has to roll it back up again, and it comes back down and back and forth, and it seems very meaningless, right? He labors with no hope for that ever changing. And Camus says you can't give him a false hope in thinking that what he's doing is meaningful. It ultimately is absurd and meaningless. However, he can kind of come to terms with it. He can kind of own it. He can learn to ultimately be authentic to himself. This is a general idea of existentialism. And I guess you could say own his life and his choices. Even though they're meaningless, fundamentally, he can still be satisfied with himself in his rebellion against that absurdity and his choice to be authentic to himself. Of course, this doesn't really escape the accusation that fundamentally Camus is a value nihilist. And if he is a value nihilist, then there's no value at all. We can't compare two states and find a valuable difference between them. So we can't prefer one state to another based on something that's valuable or not in one or the other. Value nihilism in general, Nietzsche actually talks about this to some degree as well. He's not exactly an existentialist, because he predated most of them by a good while. But he talks about something called destructive nihilism, where the weak-willed perceiving the lack of meaning of things despairs and falls into this destructive mindset. I guess I could say nihilist mindset. And this is something that Nietzsche wanted to avoid when he talked about like the will to power and the strong-willed, response to the death of God and stuff like that. He wanted to avoid this kind of despair and this destructive nihilist mindset, which comes from this idea that true rejection of meaning, we can't find valuable difference between states. We can't really prefer one to the other because there's nothing valuable to prefer one to the other based on. So in a sense, value nihilism is destructive. And we actually see that in Honkai Star Rail, interestingly enough. If we hop over to the data bank here, and we look at nihilism, we look at Path of Nihility, you can see all that we just talked about. Nihility is a mystery itself. Their form is shrouded by layers of mist. Doesn't matter the eons. They believe the ultimate fate of the multiverse is nothingness and therefore worthless. Value nihilism, right? Ultimate is nothingness and worthless. And where do we see this kind of destructive nihilism take place? Look at the self-annihilators. I think the better description is here. Yes, so here, existence is nothing, right? This is nihilism. When an organism has this thought and applies it as a guiding principle, it begins to walk on the path ruled by Ix and receive the meaningless glimpse from the eon of some distant void. So I think what this describes is actually existential dread, right? We talked about before how existential dread is aroused by questions about whether things are meaningful, right? How do we ground meaning without a mind-independent source? And then the fear that maybe we can't ground a meaning in anything, that leads to dread. Dread about whether we have meaning at all. Other questions can lead to this as well, right? It's not just this one question. But any kind of questions that make us question whether there is meaning to anything. That's often leads to existential dread. And that's precisely what he's talking about here. Existence is nothing. Existence is meaningless. So when they feel existential dread, what are the two outcomes? They either devolve and truly become nothing, becoming something called the self-annihilator. This is destructive nihilism, right? Or the organism will be captivated by the magnificence of the eon, thus becoming a doctor of chaos and their spontaneous curiosity. This corresponds more so to the other kind of response to that question. Which is, of course, as you can see here, either going towards grounding meaning in our choice of who we are, something like Jean-Paul Sartre, or maybe, actually, going back over this way, towards the objectivist view, and saying, no, there is actually meaning independent of our minds. So I'm pointing it over here because there's another philosopher I'm going to introduce soon to kind of combine the objectivist view with an existentialist view, because this is, I'm going to roughly put this underneath existentialism real quick. One of the core principles of this is authenticity. It's not just about all this stuff. So there's, for example, Kierkegaard alongside Sartre and Camus here. And Kierkegaard would not be on the same boat with Sartre with this. Kierkegaard focuses a lot more on religion and arguably more objective views of meaning, but focuses more so on authenticity to oneself. And so it's a whole other category. That's why I don't want to give the impression that this is Sartre's view is the existentialist view. But his view is very much about authenticity to oneself, as is one of the fundamental core thought processes of existentialism as a whole. And there is a philosopher I'll talk about soon, and I should say, realm of philosophy that combines his objectivist view with this kind of authenticity. We'll come back to that later. My main point is that our response to existential dread can be to fall into value nihilism, or it can be to reject it whether it's a slight rejection like Camus, where he doesn't really reject the idea of it, but just more so this destructive nihilist response to it, or something like Sartre, who asserts an entire meaning for oneself, a radical freedom that we're defining ourselves by, or by another view entirely that's more objectivist and avoids subjectivism entirely. So, Honkai Star Rail has that in this story, which is interesting enough already. But the self-annihilators in particular represent that destructive nihilism. They are individuals who have inadvertently stepped into the shadow of externality and from that moment have lost the meaning of their own existence. Their various existential properties will gradually fade away in their journey of self-annihilation. Right, so self-annihilators are very much the philosophy of that destructive nihilism, that value nihilism coming into play. Doctors of Chaos, on the other hand, uphold the creed of saving the world. If they are able to prove to X that existence is more than nothing, they could free that large and lonely soul from the depths of the void. Now, where have we heard about saving the world recently? That's right, with Robin and Sunday. Right, Doctors of Chaos are motivated by love, fundamentally. When they saw the magnificence of the Eon, they were curious. They sought the meaning of life. They believe there is meaning, even though they also had the existential dread that tells them there isn't any meaning. They fight against that. They believe that there is meaning at the same time. There's a conflict there, right? A conflict between love that wants to save everyone, and therefore, because love, if it wants to save everyone, that means it values everyone, right? Love is a force of ultimate valuing. It values, if you love something, you're willing the good for something, which means you're willing it to be fully alive. You're willing its greatest good, which means you're willing, you're valuing it. You're asserting it as valuable. So, in a sense, love is the contra-principle to nihilism and to nihility in general. So Daughters of Chaos are people who are caught up both in love and nihility. They're caught up both in this feeling of wanting to will the good for everyone and save everyone, but also fearing through existential dread that maybe you can't, maybe there isn't any value to anything. So they're very much caught up in that. And self-annihilators, too, are actually in the same boat, potentially. Because, you can scroll down here, some self-annihilators, we can see the idea of fighting back. They join Daughters of Chaos, vowing to do their best to cure others from annihilating in what little time they have left, in exchange for their own redemption. They might even try to slay the Eon that slumbers in the abyss. So, what that illustrates is that this entire dichotomy, this whole question of meaning of life, is actually being explored in Honkai Star Rail already, before 2.0. And then 2.0, 2.2 story delves more deeply into this question, because it's asking about what a fulfilled and meaningful life is. And guess who one of the main actors in the story is? It's a self-annihilator, an Acheron, right? Remember in 2.1, the very end of that story, Aventurine asks Acheron about the meaning of life. He says, why are we just here to suffer? And Acheron's response is, hope for a future answer. Because they don't have an answer yet, right? And this is one of the responses to existential dread as well. So we can simply hope for a future answer and press onwards in the meantime. And this is often the result of a conflict like in the Doctors of Philosophy, Doctors of Philosophy. No, not PhD holders here. Doctors of Chaos, who also have that conflict between love, which asserts a real meaning to everything, or nihilism, which asserts there is no meaning. So, if we bring up here as well, this slide here shows Acheron's final discussion with the Trailblazer in 2.2. And she also brings the same idea up. Listen, touch, and ponder. Therein lies the sensation. Cherish it because that's what makes us exist. Such is the only answer humans can offer when facing the nihility, which is our own existence. If the nihility represents the primal fear of life, rendering any lofty convictions insignificant under their imposing shadow, then behind this shadow there must exist the most fervent source of light in the world. In this scene, Acheron and the Trailblazer are standing in front of the black hole, right? And the black hole is there, and there's that sheen of light around the black hole. And it's easy to think that maybe that's just the light being pulled into the black hole, right? To disappear into nihility forever. But Acheron here is saying, I have another thought as well. Because if nihility represents the primal fear, the fear basically of losing all meaning, she also has an impulse in her heart that maybe it's the opposite. Maybe nihility isn't swallowing everything up and it's all meaningless. Maybe it seems meaningless, but actually the light we're seeing isn't being swallowed by the nihility, but is shining from behind it. A light source so great and so wondrous that even the greatest darkness of nihility can't fully suppress it. It's the idea, in other words, that there is meaning to life. And that meaning is so abundant, so great, so wondrous, that it can inspire someone who's facing existential dread to still believe in meaning. So that most fervent source of light in the world would be fundamentally the source of love as well. The source that inspires Doctors of Chaos to continue loving and to will to save the world, even when they're facing existential dread. That horrible, horrible, depressing feeling that there might not have any meaning at all to anything. So these are all real things that people experience. The whole lot of existentialism, existentialist literature is about this existential dread and how one responds to it. So the fact that they're kind of delving into this in Honkai Star Rail is really, really interesting. So I want to go ahead and take a look now at some recordings of the conclusion to Penacony. Because, well, first of all, I have to say I didn't actually record the concluding parts, so I'm not going to be able to show you my own recording. We're going to take a look at go watch a different streamer. This recording of it. So, just we're going to look at Ruby's. So this is not me. I'm sure you'll realize it's not me. But we're going to borrow her recording. I'll link it below so you can go look at the full video if you want as well. But we're just going to play through 2 parts of it just so I can show you what the answers that the game has for you when it comes to these questions. So this one is during the final fight. It's a short dialogue I want to display.
Guys, I saw two of my characters go down. Shut up! No! Oh my god! Why do I feel like crying?
There seems to be another kind of sound coming into the Order's symphony.
Wait, what is this?
Penacony's first and last.
Oh my god, oh my god, oh my gosh. Wow, her voice! Wait, that was so beautiful! Click to use Horizon from afar to attack enemies.
Those imprisoned in their dreams are awakening.
Oh my god! Wait, this is so beautiful! This is really beautiful!
Robin, is that you singing?
Oh my gosh! I feel like crying.
You have heard their cries.
My God.
The paradise they hoped for.
Even so, they don't know where they should be heading.
Oh, this is so sad.
That's why I had to become the lone star in the sky to guide them.
Even if that star must hang in a perpetual night of solitude.
So, in that part, for example, sorry, I need to change the volume there. So that part, for example, they're talking about, so she says, what is that part she says? Hanging in this moment of solitude right here.
Star
Perpetual night of solitude. This, I wanted to bring this up because fundamentally what Sunday's doing is an act of love, right? He's genuinely, truly seeking to save everyone. He's moved by love. And so that's why this doesn't really matter to him very much, this idea of being of his own solitude. It's a genuine thirst and desire to save people, but the problem is he doesn't know how to besides this dream that he has, to have everyone else be in a dream, because reality, unfortunately, is a cruel thing, is his belief. And so we move on to the very final part here.
Oh, wait.
Stop it, you want to achieve the paradise you promised, but the order is not the only choice.
Oh, she said stop it.
The order is not the only choice. True happiness.
True happiness and the meaning of life lie in defying the nihility and embracing all that life offers. So again, the meaning of life, this time it's literally name dropped. True happiness, meaning of life. Defying the nihility, what have we been talking about this whole time? Nihility, rejecting value nihilism. So we're rejecting value nihilism, embracing all that life offers, which is the fullness of life that we're seeking, right? And then we can jump into the very final bit here. I'll skip ahead to the cutscene.
God. This song, my heart.
So, why does life slumber?
Because
Oh my God.
someday
Whoa! Sparkle! Oh, okay. Oh my God.
we will wake up from our dreams.
Oh my God. Oh my goodness.
The night is still
Oh, I'm crying.
short.
Wait, that's so sweet. Oh my God. Stop.
The dream is over.
Oh my God. No. Oh my God.
So, this final cutscene gives us the answer that Penacony responds with us. When he asks, why does life sleep? His answer was, because that's the only way we're going to find the answer we're looking for, right? Only when we sleep can we escape from reality and save everyone in a sweet dream. But their answer is, because someday we will awake and live in reality. We'll have to face this reality. Unfortunate and sad as it is, we have to face it. And that's why as he's falling back, he reaches up towards the sky and says, the night is still too short. Because his heart's longing for this dream. Because it's kind of a double meaning there, right? On one hand, he's longing for the dream where people are truly satisfied, but he's also longing for the dream to save everyone. And as he's falling back, falling away, and Robin comes and hugs him and says, our dream is over. She's talking both about the dream that they're in and their dream to save everyone, because they have to wake up and face reality that they can't. So it's both happy and emotional and bittersweet. All these things tied together in this ending. It's a very good ending. But it's funny because I also want to bring up this philosopher here, this train of thought of philosophy, because I don't think it was intentional by the writers, but the parallels are pretty big. And I think let's go into this a bit detail here. First, about Sunday. Sunday, here's people's confessions. Right? We have those scenes where he's sitting in the confessional, looks like very Catholic, right? Confessional screen, he's sitting there, people are confessing. Only thing that's missing is like absolution in Latin and stuff. But otherwise it sounds like it's very confessional. He like recounts the Genesis like creation story over 7 days, right? On the first, he has a whole sequence in the end story. There's like, choirs and organs playing. It's very religious feeling. And he's like summoning his god, basically. Even though he also he says, "We created you," referring to God, right? Or to his eon, which is and the order. He says, "You didn't create us, we created you." It's one of his final lines in the boss fight. So there's this stuff which is very, feels very like church-like, right? It's obviously very heavily leaning into Catholicism, Christianity, and how it's portraying Sunday here. Obviously his name Sunday is an obvious reference to this. It's so funny. It's I really have to wonder whether they had this in mind or not, because there's another train of philosophy here that kind of also answers all these questions we've been talking about. So this philosophy is an objectivist one. So I'll just say this. It's based on the idea of existence is itself meaningful, right? Objective meaning. It also claims that we do not create ourselves or define our own meaning. However, so he says we instead encounter meaning and have the free choice of who we become in this encounter. So this idea is about authenticity. We are authentic to ourselves in our choice of who we become. We don't choose who we are created to be, who we are, our nature, but we choose what we are becoming through our encounters with meaning. So he still affirms a free will, a free choice. But we don't freely choose what's meaningful. We're rather encountering what's meaningful and then making choices about who we are in light of that. So the reason I think it's so funny that this is Sunday, that his answers are that it's impossible, is because the person who says all this is Pope St. John Paul II. As you can tell from the title, Pope Saint, he is in fact the priest. He hears people's confessions. He also recounts Genesis. He has choirs and organs playing. He celebrates Mass. It's just so funny that the person whose philosophy is like who gives a philosophy that kind of answers all these questions, because his philosophy also is that everyone can be saved precisely by the encounter with Christ, which is the encounter with love, with a life of love. So for the Pope, when he talks about this, what he means is that when someone's encountering love in their life, a good example of this is probably, maybe think of Flannery O'Connor's stories, because she has a story. Let me pull this up. Flannery O'Connor, short stories. I'm trying to remember which one it was. It's a very famous one. A Good Man is Hard to Find. There we go. I'm pretty certain this is it. Good Man is Hard to Find. Yep, The Misfit. That's it exactly. This is it. This story, it's a very famous story from Flannery O'Connor. And there's a moment of grace in the story. At the very end. An encounter that someone has. And this someone is the grandmother who isn't a very good person the whole story. You aren't really supposed to like her very much. You see a lot of her flaws. But at the end of the story, there's a moment of grace, a moment of encounter, where she realizes that this villain they've been, the misfit, who's been working against them, threatening their lives, that he's just like them. And there's a moment of love where she reaches out towards this person. And the misfit concludes the story with saying, if she had that moment every day of her life, she would be a saint. Or something like that. And behind this idea is that there's this encounter that we can have with love. And there's certain moments, inspired moments of goodness in our lives, where we respond to this encounter. And we're living a life that's truly and genuinely of love for others. And that's when we feel most alive. That's when we are, in fact, answering these questions about what a fulfilled and meaningful life is, and how do we attain that life. How we can be truly fulfilled, even in a world that's unequal. Even in a world where we're not all born in the same position. John Paul II's answer is we can all find that fulfillment and happiness through this encounter with love, through trying to live a life of love. Because when we encounter love, we encounter the meaning of things out in the world. The meaning of people, the meaning of the sunset. They call it the good, the true, and the beautiful are the three ways we encounter meaning. Where the good is referring to the meaning itself, the true is how we know the meaning, and the beautiful is how we perceive the meaning, right? A beautiful sunset is us perceiving meaning in the sunset. And funnily enough, that also is in Honkai Star Rail. If we look at, where is she? Idrilla the Beauty. What does she say? Witness the ultimate meaning of the world's existence through the ever-changing view of the universe known to the rest as the concept of beauty. Witness the ultimate meaning of the world's existence. Meaning. Ultimate meaning. Beauty. Once again, I'm honestly amazed at how much Honkai Star Rail, I don't know if it's intentional or not. I'd have to ask the writers. But it's just so funny to me. How much of philosophy is being referenced by this game. It's astounding and honestly for me quite exciting. But yeah, this parallel is also very funny. How he's similar to the Pope, who gives all the right answers to the questions he's asking. If only he had, been able to sit down and talk with John Paul, maybe he would have had a much better answer. And we wouldn't have the conflict that we did. Of course, maybe it's this part, right? Who knows? I don't know. But anyway, the point is, I think this sums everything up that I had to say about the story and the philosophy of it all. So, if anyone has any questions, feel free to post them in the chat and I can make another video or respond there or clarify. I have some links in the description below. And if the sound was off during the video pour, I apologize. I thought it sounded fine on my end, but OBS, I'm not fully familiar with how to tune all this stuff for different sound sources, so I'll try to fix it up post and see if it sounds good. But if it's like too quiet or something, then hopefully you can click on the link to View Ruby's channel and see that video, and then you can watch that part for yourself, because the music, for example, is very good in that scene. Voice acting's fantastic, so you can always enjoy that. Anyways, this has been a long video. Hopefully you all learned something, and yeah, I really love this philosophy, man. It's really, really interesting to me. I love to talk about it. Feel free to ask questions, and then I also love this game that somehow pulls in all these different ideas from philosophy, which is so cool. I want to pick the brains of the writers someday. If they ever somehow give my 2-viewer channel a glimpse. But anyway, that's all for now. Let me know if y'all have ideas or thoughts for the videos. Otherwise, I'll talk to y'all later.